Well, good evening and welcome. My name is David Fott. I'm a professor of political science here at UNLV and director of the Great Works Academic Certificate Program here at UNLV. This is a program that exists to encourage undergraduates to spend as much time as they can with the greatest minds who have ever lived. And that means have conversations with dead people. It's possible. A 9-page list of those minds can be found on our program's website. The program requires 12 credits of courses featuring primary sources written by authors on our list. It's a way to certify that you have taken rigorous courses and a way to impress graduate schools and employers. I won't say more about the program now, but feel free to speak with me after the lecture or send email to david.fott@unlv.edu. I am most grateful that funding for today's lecture has come from the Jack Miller Center for Teaching America's Founding Principles and History. Our speaker tonight, Lucas Morel, is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics and head of the Department of Politics at Washington and Lee University. He holds a PhD in political science from Claremont Graduate University. He is the author of, most recently, Lincoln and the American Founding, and before that, Lincoln's Sacred Effort, Defining Religion's Role in American Self-Government. He's the editor of Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages, and Ralph Ellison and the Raft of Hope, a political companion to Invisible Man. He's co-editor of the book, The New Territory, Ralph Ellison and the 21st Century. Professor Morel conducts high school teacher workshops for the Ashbrook Center, for the Jack Miller Center, for the Gilder-Lehrman Institute, the Bill of Rights Institute, and the Liberty Fund. He's a former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, a founding member of the Academic Freedom Alliance, a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society, a consultant on the Library of Congress exhibits on Lincoln and the Civil War, and currently serves on the US Semiquincentennial Commission, which will plan activities to commemorate the founding of the United States of America. Semiquincentennial, I'll let you figure out when the United States was actually founded. Last year, he served as the Worsham Teaching Fellow at Hillsdale College's Andel Graduate School of Government in Washington, D.C., teaching courses on Frederick Douglass and the modern civil rights movement. Professor Morel's topic for today is Frederick Douglass, the Making of an America. If you are watching online, welcome as well, and if you have questions arising during the lecture, please type them into the chat feature. This lecture is being recorded. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Morel.
Thank you, David, and yeah, thank you for this. First time I've been to your campus at night, but it's a lot better today. And I also joined David and thank you Center for sponsor this event. February is Black History Month. So the idea for a month to be set aside to focus on the Black contribution to America began actually as something known as Negro History Week. Its creator was Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Harvard-trained historian who was the son of former slaves. he envisioned, and I'm going to use the locution of the day, in the early 20th century, he envisioned a Negro History Week to address the problem of an incomplete and therefore biased American history. He chose the second week in February for the annual celebration of Black History, what we call Black History Month now, because it marked the birthdays of two great Americans, great in part because of what they did for Black Americans, and those two great Americans were Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. This annual commemoration of Black achievement was a kind of public service announcement, a way in part to bolster Black American pride, as well as to alleviate the ignorance of white Americans, ignorance about their own country's history, what went into producing it. He thought that by having this kind of week, the impact would be a good one, ameliorative one, or it's one that would help reduce racial prejudice in this country. He thought that by having this annual celebration, it would actually teach Black Americans, as he put it, to love this country, which they and their forefathers have done so much to develop. He added that we should, quote, emphasize not Negro history, but the Negro in the history, his words. And so it's in that spirit that I think we should study and appreciate one of the greatest of the Black Americans past, and that's this man, Frederick Douglass. How did he help Americans reduce the gap between what they have long professed to believe and what they did that fell short of the nation's founding ideals? With so much discussion today about systemic racism, we hear little about America's systemic justice, by which I mean the principles and institutions that Douglass found in the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, which he believed held the key to the abolition of slavery, full and equal citizenship under the law. Without America's ideals, without its system of justice, this country would not have seen any progress in securing the rights of its citizens of color, what I consider the long civil rights movement that constitutes our nation's history since 1776. That's how I date it. I follow Lincoln here. In speaking of systems, Frederick Douglass distinguished between the Constitution and the nation's cultural influences like the church and the operators of these institutions. The flaws of this nation, he thought they were significant. He located in the people who employ these institutions or systems that shape the thoughts and practices of the American people. I call this lecture, Frederick Douglass, the making of an American. We'll see that Freudian slip. We'll see that Douglass wasn't always a patriotic. We can never forget that he was born into slavery. How he became one of the most eloquent advocates, defenders of America. What he discovered about a country that for many years did not secure his natural rights, that is my task, our task this evening. Next to William Lloyd Garrison, editor of The Liberator, Frederick Augustus Bailey Douglass was America's most famous abolitionist. According to a recent book, he was the most photographed American, perhaps the most photographed person in the world in the 19th century. Born into slavery near Easton, Maryland, in February 1818, he escaped 20 years later, and in 1845, as many of you know, published Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. That in the title. Soon after its publication, he had to flee the United States. Named names in his book regarding his early life, it made him liable to capture in the United States under the law at that time, which was passed as early as 1793, Fugitive Slave Act. After speaking on the abolition circuit for 2 years in England, Ireland, and Scotland, Frederick Douglass returned to America. but he could do so only after he was legally manumitted. Friends of his on both sides of the pond paid 150 pounds sterling, about 750 bucks American, for his freedom. He was no longer an outlaw outside of the law's protection, but a free man in the eyes of the law. He then edited an abolition newspaper called the North Star, spoke almost daily to emancipate slaves and rid the nation of color prejudice. He followed the career of someone I hold near and dear, Abraham Lincoln, and during the Civil War, despite being a fierce critic of Lincoln, came to appreciate the president's efforts on behalf of emancipation, Black enlistment in the armed forces. After the war, Douglass was actually appointed U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia and then minister to what we now call Haiti. He was a longtime advocate for women's rights. He was an early adopter on women's rights, if you will. Attended a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C. the morning of his death, February 20th, 1895. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a leading activist for women's rights, recalled watching Douglass give a speech. He stood there like an African prince, majestic in his wrath, as with wit, satire, and indignation, he graphically described the bitterness of slavery, the humiliation of subjection to those who, in all human virtues and powers, were inferior to himself. His ferocity of spirit was matched by a fierce intelligence that produced not only his renowned narrative, the first of 3 biographies, how many have you written? But also speeches and editorials that stand as lasting contributions to the progress of liberty in America. That intelligence led a man who had every reason to hate America become one of its greatest defenders. Early in his career as an abolition speaker, Douglass said, "I have no love for America. I have no patriotism. I have no country." Then he asked, "What country have I? The institutions of this country do not know me, do not recognize me as a man." Those institutions, major shapers of American life, the church, the government, and he was specific, the Constitution. This is 1847. Given that American slavery could not exist without the cooperation of the northern free states with the southern slaveholding states, Douglass said this of the federal government: "I desire to see its overthrow as speedily as possible." The Constitution shivered into 1,000 fragments. By this point in his speaking career, he was used to being heckled with racial epithets, pelted, yes, with the proverbial rotten eggs and tomatoes, navigating his way through anti-abolition mobs. Guess what? These were in New England, not the South. His condemnation of American government and Constitution made him few friends among those not already in the abolition camp. Abolitionists have a hard time seeing this today, but they were a fringe element back in the antebellum days of America. Till 1849, Frederick Douglass could not love a country that didn't love him. To his credit, I believe, and America's, he did not hold that position for long. He eventually claimed America as his country, calling the principles of the Declaration of Independence saving principles, interpreting the Constitution, as he called it, as a glorious liberty document. He found that reading the Constitution the way his mentor, William Lloyd Garrison, read it, as a pro-slavery document, he said this contradicted his preamble, overlooked the principles and mechanisms of freedom, levers of freedom it contained. He noticed that the Constitution never used the word slave or slavery. It permitted Congress to ban the importation of slaves as early as January 1, 1808, which they did. Therefore, he said, it leans to freedom, not slavery, and looked to the abolition of slavery rather than to its perpetuity. In a public career that spanned half a century, Douglass joined a vanguard of blacks and whites in the struggle to align this nation's principles with, to align this nation's practices with its noblest professions. That struggle for him began as a personal one when he decided to free himself from the legal bondage into which he was born. In his narrative, Douglass famously recounted an incident. He decided to resist a flogging at the hands of an overseer named Covey. Mr. Covey seemed now to think he had me, do what he pleased. At this moment, from whence came the spirit, I don't know. Resolved to fight. Suiting my action to the resolution, I seized Covey hard by the throat, and as I did, I rose. Douglass called this turning point of his career as a slave, when he resolved, quote, however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. I did not hesitate it. Let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me. In his 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, he commented, I had reached the point at which I was not afraid to. This spirit made me a free man, fact, while I remained a slave. Douglass took the measure of his oppressive circumstances, most especially of his God-given capacity as a human being, and determined not to remain a victim of his environment, of those circumstances. He would pursue his own liberation and that of his fellow bondsmen, eventually making a career reminding Americans of the ideals of the Declaration and what he saw were the protections in the Constitution. Remarkably, when his race was held against him, as he exercised the rights of a free man, he never took it to heart. He was one time forced to ride in a baggage car because of his unpopular color. That happened. White friends apologized for the insulting treatment, to which he replied, you cannot degrade Frederick Douglass. The soul that is within me, no man can degrade. A few weeks after Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, Douglass gave a lecture titled Popular Error and Unpopular Truth. He said there was no such thing as a new truth. Error might be old or new. Truth was as old as the universe. Of the Emancipation Proclamation, he declared a fatal blow has at last been struck at the root of a gigantic evil. President's proclamation given the slaves the legal right to liberty. Now they could obtain their personal freedom without trampling on civil laws. Notice his respect for the rule of law. He recognized that his own escape to freedom, even though entirely just in terms of the laws of nature, it had violated the laws, positive laws of men. The chief aim of self-government was to make the civil laws comport with laws of nature, nature's God, the Declaration puts it. As Douglass suggests, to act consistent with the laws of nature should never contradict the law of this country. Like a good American, Douglass understood the purpose of government was to protect, not to rob human beings of their liberty, liberty with which they were born. So he saw the Emancipation Proclamation as securing to those enslaved by the laws of human beings rights that they actually possessed by nature, rights that human laws should have been protecting all along. This was an important observation, born of America's own founding as a nation based upon timeless truths. The idea of universal natural rights was what Douglass considered an unpopular truth. Unpopular because until the 1770s, no nation on earth operated according to what Americans held to be self-evidently true. Douglass noted that with the Emancipation Proclamation, quote, Mr. Lincoln has dared to apply the old truth of human liberty to this time. He has dared to declare the truth. Declaration. With Lincoln and the American founders, Douglass believed human equality was one of those truths as old as the universe. Under the pressure of a civil war, the self-evident truth that all men are created equal would begin to be secured for Black Americans. But it was chiefly a contest of words, not a battle of arms, to which Douglass attributed the abolition of slavery. Though wrung out by the stern dictates of military necessity, he declared, it was in reality a moral necessity. Without what he called a principle in man which induces him to accept truth, Douglass held little hope for progress in human affairs. For him, speech, meaning an appeal to right, not violence, an appeal to mere might. This appeal to right held the key to progress in securing liberty in America. Douglass pointed out that it was slavery that required violations of free speech. But he was confident, quote, that truth must triumph under a system of free discussion. He even affirmed Thomas Jefferson's confidence that error might be left free so long as truth was free to combat it. But he added, equally true, though not always equally manifest, is it that error can never be safely tolerated when truth is not left free to combat it. Freedom of speech was no abstract principle for Douglass, but the very engine of a society that intended to rule itself by reason rather than mere force and intimidation. He knew the insecurity of slaveholding societies. They censored the mails of abolition publications. They mobbed and lynched speakers who argued for emancipation, and even prohibited enslaved Black people to read. They're so afraid. Of all the deprivations Douglass attributed to slavery, the denial of an education he ranked as the worst of slavery's evils. Quote, it would forever unfit him to be a slave, end quote. This is what Douglass recalled his legal master saying when he discovered that his wife was teaching Douglass his letters, teaching him how to spell. That moment, Douglass wrote, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. Simple thing, learning how to read, indicated to him that human beings possess the freedom to think, to make choices, decisions about how to live. That was the key to progress in human civilization. In focusing upon human equality and individual rights, principles he learned in the United States, Douglass departed from those in his day who wanted to connect Black Americans to an African past. He was a steadfast opponent of what was known at the time as Black colonization, emigration. Back to Africa, as Marcus Garvey would more famously put it in the 1920s. Douglass discounted the value of reclaiming an African heritage for Blacks in America. He said, all this native land talk, he said, is nonsense. The native land of the American Negro is America. That's what Frederick Douglass said. It is a mark of their perception, fortitude, resilience, and even good humor that Africans on American soil, in the face of pervasive racial bigotry, nevertheless became Americans in terms of what they thought, both politically and religiously. Denied the right to vote most of the time in most of the American colonies and then states, Blacks remained convinced that government by consent of the governed was the only just basis for government. Denied membership in most American churches throughout most of American history. Blacks still converted to the Christian faith.
Through it all, Douglass wrote, "Our hearts believed while they ached and bled." In the face of color prejudice, blacks had taken America at her word. All men are created equal. And believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you shall be saved. And they were committed to make a life and a future for themselves and their posterity in the United States. After many 1,000 gone, if America was not the land of these many black generations, what land could be? Douglass was unwilling to let their many contributions and sacrifices go unappreciated and unrewarded. An American past, for him, not an African past, was where blacks in America should go looking for a heritage they could claim legitimately as their own. This argument against mass immigration of blacks away from America can be applied to African heritage arguments that Douglass believed weaken, in his words, the Negro's hold on one country. I think this is a profound observation by Douglass. For much of what white American practice, legal and social, gave black Americans plenty of reasons not to hold on to, let alone love the land of their birth. Douglass, however, placed great stock in how much blacks had contributed to the development of America. Despite the many ways the nation fell short of fulfilling its promise to all of its citizens. And so Douglass concluded, quote, "Our people should be let alone, given a fair chance to work out their own destiny where they are." He thought whatever gave black Americans reason to look abroad for their real home, while they remained here in the United States, Douglass thought, that would forever keep them from being viewed and accepted as full members of the American community. The result, in Douglass's words, we do not take a firm hold upon the advantages and opportunities about us. Tell black Americans their native land is Africa, that their true home is anywhere but where they currently reside and intend to make a life for themselves. Douglass answered that in his day, this mindset kept blacks, quote, in an unsettled condition, a constant state of alarm. It paralyzes their energies, breaks up and destroys the sentiment of patriotism. Regarding America's white majority, he thought it unwise of them to do such violence to love of one's country, tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. That's 1896. Frederick Douglass, 30 years earlier, wrote the following. The Constitution, quote, knows no distinction between citizens on account of color. Here, Douglass noticed a tremendous advantage that black Americans had in their struggle for civil and political rights in America. Most white Americans at least claimed to believe in these principles of fairness and equality under the law. This belief was so strong, they wrote it into their most authoritative documents. They put it on paper. Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, there for everyone to see. So when Martin Luther King Jr. remarked, all we say to America is, that should be true to what you said on paper, he was channeling the muse of Frederick Douglass. When King said, somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly, somewhere I read of the freedom of speech, somewhere I read of the freedom of the press, he drew attention to those same levers of freedom that Douglass saw as he lived among his oppressors. Again, they put it in writing. After all, somewhere I read, there was a time in American history when a portion of white America changed its mind about its political principles, especially those that should govern a nation of different races. These white Americans were a minority of the country, but large enough that they had attempted to establish a separate country based on different principles. New ones, in fact, as they argued, the foremost of which was white supremacy. This was, of course, the Confederate States of America. Those white Americans, made the enslavement of blacks a fundamental, express principle of their new and improved Constitution. Where the old Constitution, the Constitution of Washington and Madison and Hamilton, never mentioned slavery explicitly until the nation decided to abolish it in the 13th Amendment. The Confederate Constitution expressly provided for its protection in several of its provisions. What lever would a black person have in the Confederacy to secure liberty by the laws or courts? To what principles of freedom and equality, what government by consent could a black person there appeal in a nation who, Alexander Stephens, vice president, wrote, had its foundations laid and cornerstone rest upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. Stephens added, "This our new government is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." Blacks could claim no civil right, no political, no constitutional right in the expressly systemically racist Confederate States of America. So Douglass concluded that, quote, "The burden of our demand upon the American people shall simply be justice and fair play. We utterly repudiate all invidious distinctions, whether in our favor or against us. Only ask for a fair field and no favor." Douglass found those principles inherent in the principles of the American founding. As President Bill Clinton said in his first inaugural address, probably the best thing he ever said as president, "Our democracy must be not only the envy of the world, but the engine of our renewal. There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America." But as much as Douglass did to promote the uplift of blacks in America, he was, in fact, not a fan of what was known at the time as race pride. He called it a false foundation and a positive evil. He proclaimed it the very thing we're fighting against. For the better part of American history, black Americans wanted nothing to do with the color line that separated them from the rest of the American population. Douglass said, "It's our enemies who sought to deepen and widen the line of separation between the white and colored people of this country." And given that blacks were a numerical minority in the United States, color had never been a help to them. What he learned from the writings of, yes, slaveholders like Washington, like Jefferson, like Madison, was that the only relevant minority in America was the minority of one, the individual. In Douglass's words, quote, "Color should not be a criterion of rights," end quote. He recognized that the protection of rights of a specific group, whites, was harming his group, blacks. The politics of racial identity diverted government away from protecting rights that every individual and towards assigning benefits and burdens according to whatever interest group controlled the government. Douglass concluded, "I know of no rights of race superior to the rights of humanity." A steadfast believer in equality under the law, he did not believe race should be the measure of anyone's constitutional rights. His argument against race pride also led him to criticize what he called complexional institutions. That's his phrase. Over a decade before Lincoln was elected president, he argued, All distinctions founded on complexion ought to be repealed, repudiated, and forever abolished. And every right, privilege, and immunity now enjoyed by the white man ought to be as freely granted to the man of color. He thought colored conventions, colored exhibitions, his words, colored associations and institutions, these were hindrances rather than helps in achieving a higher and better estimation in the public mind of black people as a race. He understood that white prejudice, north and south of the Mason-Dixon line, would compel black Americans to form complexional institutions as a stopgap measure. But he argued that this short-term resort to black associations and institutions was not good in principle. It reinforced a racial mindedness that those organizations were set up to eliminate. He believed an emphasis upon race was a losing proposition for blacks in America. Instead of equal protection of the laws, Douglass declared, you lay down a rule for the black man that you apply to no other class of your citizens. And when he was asked the misbegotten question, what shall be done with the Negro when freed, he answered, let us alone. Do nothing with us, for us, or by us, as a particular class. I affirm that the broadest and bitterest of the black man's misfortunes is the fact that he is everywhere regarded and treated as an exception to the principles and maxims which apply to other men. Douglass argued that as long as blacks were seen and treated as exceptions, color prejudice would continue and they would never be seen as full members of the American community. That said, did Douglass really mean that black Americans should be let alone? Do nothing? He went on to explain. All I ask is, give him a chance to stand on his own legs. If you see him on his way to school, let him alone. Don't disturb him. If you see him going to the dinner table at a hotel, let him go. If you see him going to the ballot box, let him alone. Don't disturb him. If you see him going into a workshop, just let him alone. Your interference is doing him a positive injury. So, blacks pursuing an education, a meal, the vote, a job. Does the government owe a black person, any person, anything when it comes to these vital pursuits? It was 1865 when Douglass made these statements. His audience knew the context of his examples. Blacks were not given a chance to stand on their own legs. They were harassed, persecuted, even killed in their attempts to learn, to eat, to vote, to learn a trade. To be left alone, as Douglass insisted, did not mean to be left at the mercy of a racist mob. It meant for government to do its job. No more, no less, just as it did for every other American citizen. This was true equality under law, which is why the vote was so important to Douglass. To be freed from an individual legal master, but not allowed to vote, was simply to become, as he put it, the slave of the community. He concluded where universal suffrage is the rule, where that is the fundamental idea of the government. To rule us out is to make us an exception. To brand us with a stigma of inferiority, it is to invite to our heads the missiles of those about us. He gave many reasons for blacks, and in fact, many reasons to whites for the franchise, for the vote. But this concern for public opinion, what a ban against black voting taught white people regarding the humanity of blacks and therefore what they were owed by government, that was a long-standing priority for Douglass. But he insisted that the vote be granted to blacks not because they were black, but because they were citizens. He believed the government of all should be partial to none. Anything that made blacks a special case in the public eye, in his mind, would undermine their equality as American citizens and as human beings. This would actually reinforce a white supremacist mindset. He did not see how the myth of white supremacy could be dispelled if blacks were exempted from the rules that applied to everyone else. With color prejudice as the great enemy of black progress in the United States, most of Douglass's efforts on behalf of civil and political rights were directed toward promoting policies that eliminated government distinctions based upon race. Instead of living as an exception to the rules that applied to others, he said blacks should integrate with the majority white population as much as possible. They should endeavor, quote, to make themselves and be made by others a part of the American people in every sense of the word, end quote. Whites needed to recognize that their destiny was tied up with the destiny of blacks. I know you've heard that from some other people. They were channeling Douglass. Douglass encouraged blacks to avoid self-segregation. Quote, we should distribute ourselves among the people, build our houses where if they take fire, other houses will be in danger. Common dangers will create common safeguards. Near the end of his life, he put it this way: it's better to regard ourselves as a part of the whole than as the whole of a part. It is better to be a member of the great human family than a member of a particular variety of the human family. In regard to men as in regard to things, the whole is more than a part. And so along these lines, he exhorted blacks to become members and leaders of organizations and institutions run by whites. They could then learn how these organizations and institutions operate, gain experience and skills, and best of all, work alongside whites, which would afford examples of character and competence on the part of blacks that would undermine white prejudice. For Douglass, the way to eliminate racial bigotry was to become a part of the wholeness upon which America was founded. This led him to preach the principles of human equality and the rights of American citizenship. In becoming an American, Douglass helped America become a better version of itself by challenging white Americans to trust the operation of their own principles. He enabled a diverse American citizenry to see each other as fellow citizens and therefore understand what they owed each other under their common government. President Whitfield recently encouraged your campus, quote, to think deeply how we can all better see and understand each other. I hope that my reflections on Frederick Douglass help us do precisely that. And in that spirit, I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Do I moderate this?
As you wish.
All right.
Moderate
This is the part where I get to evade your questions.
You can moderate yourself.
If I step in front, the mic won't pick me up? Do I need to stay here?
I think the acoustics are pretty good.
Can I?
Oh, you can walk around wherever
I
you
got a
want.
high register, so I. All right, very good. All right, nobody wants to go first. Should I ask myself a question and then that primes the pump? Got you.
And at what point did, thank you, Brother Ralph, excellent.
Appreciate it.
At what point did Frederick Douglass go from being angry to becoming more like a constitutionalist? And then at that same time, in that time era, did black Africans see him as a crusader or more as an apologist for the white power that was in place?
Wow. I don't know that he ever got over being angry,
Okay.
right? I mean, you ever see a picture of Douglass? I got one. This one's one of his more, yeah. I said he was the most photographed man, and I'm daring you to acknowledge, I've never seen a picture of him. So this is probably one of the more polite, and he's young in this one, but he's never smiling in the camera, let's put it that way. although I think it's too simple to say, what did he do with his, was he angry and then was he not angry? I mean, the question was, how do we channel that energy? How do we channel true righteous indignation? Okay? The quotes early in my speech were from his first speech when he returned from the UK after he was legally allowed to come back to the United States and not risk apprehension. Remember, well, you have this thing about, oh, self-emancipation, who freed the slaves? And the slaves freed themselves. Look, you can walk all you want across the Mason-Dixon line. How free are you? Do you know where those slaves were going? They weren't going to New York. Where were they going? Come on. Canada. Why Canada? Because in the United States, you were outside of the law's protection. If you were legally enslaved somewhere and left that state, right? There's the fugitive slave clause. It doesn't say slave in the Constitution, but there is a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. 1793, they passed that law that required states to extradite, if you will, an alleged fugitive slave, and then that was revised in 1850, notoriously, and I'll let you look it up. Wikipedia is good for this. Look up why that revision was so notorious. After 1850, guess what black person was at risk of apprehension in the United States? Everyone. I'm going to go ahead and tell you. If I had time to say this, I would say this. Couldn't speak in your own defense. No legal counsel. Judge was paid $10 if you said, yeah, good enough for government work. Yeah, you're the one. $10, $5. I'm like, now everybody knows they've been here for forever, right? 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. I'm trying not to digress too much here, but it made any black American liable to kidnapping. Okay, so physical removal is one thing, but are you protected by your government? That's the key. Douglass was not protected by his government, even though he physically removed himself from enslavement in Maryland. He had to remove himself from the United States for 2 years after the publication of his narrative. He only returns after he's been legally manumitted, okay? That first speech he gives in 1847 is called The Right to Criticize American Institutions. That's the title. And every time I teach Douglass, I have my students read that speech where he says, what country have I? I have no country, right? Constitution to be shivered into 1,000 fragments. He starts editing the North Star for a few years. He starts reading more. Gerrit Smith, Lysander Spooner, Wendell Phillips, some other dude. Yeah, we'll go with some other dude. He becomes persuaded that, Garrison's reading of the Constitution is pro-slavery. I don't see slave in there. You ever read the preamble? Blessings of liberty? How's that consistent with slavery? He said it should be read according to the plain language of the Constitution, between the four corners, as it were. And so, 1850, he announces, I think I'm going to change my opinion. And then probably the greatest speech he ever delivered. What to the slave is the 4th of July? July 5th, 1852. Probably the most frequently assigned speech. If you read a speech by Douglass, that's going to be the speech. So I contrast that 1847 speech with the 1852 one, where he calls the Constitution, read in light of its preamble, its principles, its mechanisms for freedom. He calls it a glorious liberty document. So the anger part, he just channels it. I mean, he's a consummate political activist. He never gives that up. Okay? So, but he is finding that righteous indignation and anger, that moral outrage that he has, needs to find, in his mind, a more productive outlet. And he believes it's a more principled one, reading the Constitution as pro-liberty, not the way his mentor, Garrison, saw it as pro-slavery. What was the second part of your...
Did African Americans at that time...
Oh, yeah, what did they see him as a crusader or as an apologist for the status quo? Yes. In other words, yeah, can you think of any leader in the United States, and in fact, not just rabble-rousers, any leader who had an impact that was universally loved or recognized? No, right? They all have their critics. Booker T. Washington had his critics. W.E. Du Bois had his critics, right? Douglass had his critics, for sure. Yeah, I don't know how much more to say about that. What impresses me about Douglass is this term, that someone who could feel the worst of America, right? Born into legal enslavement, come to find something in this country, a lot of things in this country, which, by the way, it's not just the principles and it's not just institutions, political like a constitution, cultural like the church, but it's people. Because after all, if the people aren't as good as their principles, what happens? Slavery is what happens, okay? And so Douglass had to come to a point where he thought there was sufficient conscience that could be aroused in the American people in order to make appeals to the things they wrote on paper about equality and rights and government by consent. If there wasn't sufficient moral content to the souls of white folk, if you will, yeah, his pleas, I mean, you could rant and rave all you want. What good is it going to do for you, right? Wait, let me, I like to reserve students first. Student? You pretend like you're one? No? You had your hand up?
A question from the audience.
Oh, question, fire away. And then you're in the queue.
This is a question from Dr. John Hay. Lincoln somewhat famously waffled on the issue of abolition, at least before 1863. To what extent was Douglass supportive of Lincoln and the Republican Party prior to the Emancipation Proclamation?
To what extent was Lincoln in support of emancipation, did you say, or abolition?
To what extent was Douglass?
Oh, Douglass in support of Lincoln before the Emancipation Proclamation. Douglass followed Lincoln's career starting in Illinois when Lincoln debated Stephen Douglas, a categorical white supremacist. I mean, he put George Wallace to the curb in terms of white supremacy. White basis, white basis, white basis. Douglas said this all the time. Stephen Douglas. By the way, Stephen Douglas with one S actually was born Stephen Douglas with two S's. He dropped the second S in the early 50s. I wonder why. I don't really wonder why. So Douglas knew Lincoln. He did not meet him until the summer of '63. And then met him again in '64, and then briefly after the second inaugural address. Douglas was a fierce critic of Lincoln's until the Emancipation Proclamation, and was somewhat critical even after, because black enlisted soldiers and sailors were not treated equally in terms of pay, in terms of promotion, and retaliation for imprisonment, right? They were not treated as prisoners of war. They were treated as escaped slaves, okay? And Douglas thought and told Lincoln to his face, you need to do more about that. So a fierce critic of Lincoln's. Critic of the Emancipation Proclamation because it didn't go far enough. Why? Because the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free all the slaves. It only freed slaves in areas still held by rebellious Americans. It didn't free them in Delaware, in Missouri, in Kentucky, in Maryland, because those citizens of those states remained loyal to the Union. Didn't free them in Tennessee, because that was under military occupation. Who's the military governor? Future vice president. I'll let you figure out who that is. The only, by the way, senator who stayed in the Senate after his state seceded. Tennessee. Do you need more hints? Tap away on computers. So very, very much a critic of Lincoln's, but appreciated that Lincoln was, as it were, riding the wave in terms of emancipation, finding it ultimately only constitutionally legitimate to emancipate slaves because he could turn it to a clearly uncontroversial action by a president, which is what? To preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, right? Verbatim part of his duties under Article 2 of the Constitution. Most famously, in 1876, Douglas says two things. He says a number of things, but in another great speech, oration to Abraham Lincoln upon the dedication of the Freedmen's Memorial in April of 1876, he says Lincoln is, what does he say, preeminently the white man's president because he shares the prejudices of whites. He says this on the dedication of a statue to Lincoln with President Grant right there in Lincoln Park, what we call Lincoln Park, 10 blocks behind the Supreme Court today. But he goes on in this speech, and he said, viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Douglass's ground, because Douglass is an abolitionist, Lincoln is not. Viewed from the abolition ground, Lincoln is slow, tardy, dull, and indifferent. But that's not the end of the paragraph. Douglass goes on to say, but viewed from the grounds of a statesman, that's what he's required to consult, which is the opinions not just of black people, but of the entire country. Opinions he needs, not just to emancipate slaves, but to do what? To preserve the Union. He has to have the country on his side to accomplish that task. Douglass didn't see that hierarchy of ends. Douglass believed the Civil War should be a war for abolition, from the jump, from the start. And Lincoln disagreed with that. Viewed from the grounds of a statesman, Douglass confesses Lincoln was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. So you have this combination of assessments of Douglass, and I think in retrospect, he comes to see Lincoln as not simply, preeminently the white man's president. In fact, in June of 1865, fairly soon after the assassination of Lincoln, he calls Lincoln emphatically the black man's president. His words, emphatically the black man's president. And so it's Douglass trying to figure out how to square Lincoln's clear anti-slavery convictions with what appeared to be a reticence on Lincoln's part to do more for black people in this country. But he, again, confesses later, on retrospect, like, let's review the tape, he says, I gotta admit, boy, if Lincoln had moved quicker in the ways that abolitionists wanted him to move, what would have happened? The prejudice, as Douglass puts it, that was poured onto our heads as blacks, guess where that prejudice would have been directed? Boom, onto Lincoln's. How successful would he have been in facing the challenges that he faced during the Civil War? So I think in the end, his mature judgment was one that I think recognized the statesmanship, which is rare in any politics, American or otherwise. His mature judgment recognized the statesmanship of Lincoln. In short, that it was good that Lincoln was anti-slavery but not an abolitionist. That his devotion, he was equally devoted to the Constitution as Douglass was, but his understanding of the respect that he had to pay to popular opinion was one that was essential and critical for him to accomplish what he did as president during this unprecedented war, right? Fighting an external enemy is one thing. Fighting amongst yourselves, that's a whole other kettle of fish. Please.
So, in your opinion, how would Douglass respond to our current moment with regard to critical race theory and Black Lives Matter if he was not a race pride man?
Mm-hmm. Couldn't just have me deal with critical race or Black Lives Matter. I gotta do both. Why didn't you could just go ahead and say 1619 Project. I know you wanted to say it. You have your home now when that's your part 2. I hope you saw that look, Douglass spoke for a long time, right? Born in 1818, died in 1895, spent his entire adult career giving speeches and writing editorials, mostly giving speeches. He was away from home more than he was at home. So anybody giving a talk on Frederick Douglass, there's a lot to pick from. And I'm emphasizing certain things. David Blight would not give my talk. And I know David, we've done podcasts together, Zooms together, National Constitution Center, all that sort of stuff. Nick Bukala, Pete Myers, other experts on Douglass would emphasize what they would emphasize. So I would just say, you read Douglass for yourself. Don't read books about Douglass. Read Douglass for yourself, and you come to your own conclusions. One thing I emphasized today was Douglass was willing to bank his life and his public career and what he believed was the destiny, the future of black people in this country on the principles and institutions and moral goodwill of this country. And to do that, he recognized that the logical conclusion, in fact, the very premise of this country was that there can be no exceptions. There can be no exceptions. You do it on race, well, why not religion? Why not sex? Why not nation of origin? Why not ethnicity? Why not height? Color of eye. Douglass says the problem, for him, slavery wasn't the worst thing in the world. You know what the worst thing in the world when Douglass was alive? Color prejudice. You beat that bad boy down, slavery's gone. Segregation is gone. Jim Crow is gone. Black codes are gone. Color prejudice was the bête noire, right? That was, as Lincoln called it, the great behemoth. Lincoln called slavery the great behemoth of danger, but it would not have been a danger without race undergirding it. And so for me, what I like to emphasize, or at least direct my students' attention to, is the fact that Douglass was willing to say, don't do us favors, but that also means what? Don't place any burdens on us. That's what he meant when he said, let us alone. Let us alone. If you don't do these stupid things to yourselves, why do it to us? If you treat them, any them, as an exception, what does it do to our faith and our confidence in what our founders believed was self-evidently true? That what? All men, meaning all human beings, are created equal. You make an exception of black people, or pick your group, pick your minority. If you make an exception of them, what are you doing? You're actually reinforcing the very prejudice you're trying to get rid of. What I call the myth of white supremacy. Right? White supremacy is driven not by supremacy. It's driven by insecurity. It's driven by fear. And so Douglass says, I have every faith, every confidence that black people can achieve as well as white people. Why? Because they're people. Because they're people. Let's get this country to live as consistently as possible with its own principles. That's the key. That's how we can see one another. I really love that your president said this about this question about how we see one another and therefore how we understand each other. That's got to be key. And if we don't understand, if we can't look around this room, and look, there's a lot of differences. There's a lot of, I do this in my class, there's a lot of diversity in here, right? Beauty, foot speed out there, and so there's a lot of diversity. I didn't say I was the most beautiful, just throwing that out as a category. Look around this room, it's tremendous diversity. But if we can't see what's common here, if we can't see what we share as students, or as Americans, or as human beings, right? If we start saying, I noticed this thing that you identify as, that I do not, and I'm gonna make that a principle for political action, then what happens to politics? What happens to self-government? You know what happens is it becomes crude majoritarianism. I hope you're in the majority, and you get to stay in the majority, because if you aren't, guess what's gonna happen? You know what's gonna happen. You're gonna feel like you can't trust your government. What drives resistance? What drives not my president? It's precisely that, in my opinion. Now, you want to tackle critical race theory? That's a whole other kettle of fish, because then we have to find what the critical in critical race means, which comes from critical legal studies. And then if you want to go there, that means you have to go back and talk about Karl Marx. Yes, you do. You have to start talking about looking at a society, not in terms of what people share, but in terms of what Marx or others believed were profound differences among human beings. More profound even than sex, male and female. More profound than race. The differences of what? Oppressor and oppressed. First line of the Communist Manifesto. Right? That's an entirely different vision, if you will. That's an entirely different conception of what drives human history. And it is a conception that there's no surprise to me that they are emphatic and clear about, that they do not look at the world the way typical liberals look at the world. Right? That all men are created equal stuff, that equality under the law stuff. The emphasis is on equity, it's not on equality. Right? Those camps, critical legal, not critical legal, but critical race theory. You mentioned Black Lives Matter. That one's a harder one, and I teach a course on race and equality. I've taught it for probably 20 years now. And when it comes to Black Lives Matter, that's a very difficult part of my syllabus to teach because there isn't one person who has coherently laid out what the theory behind BLM, or the Movement for Black Lives, is. It's a very decentralized movement, so nobody can say, I mean, you have the three women who founded it, okay? But they haven't written a treatise, right? Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, otherwise known as, and Charles Hamilton wrote in 1967, Black Power. There's a book, here's your treatise. Guess where BLM gets a lot of their ideas from? Black Power, that book. So I teach that book ahead of teaching Black Lives Matter so that the students can see, oh, this kind of looks like their playbook. All right, so what do they say about colonization in the first chapter? Weird, right? The book on Black Power, the first chapter isn't about Black Power. Guess what it's about? White power. That's Ture and Hamilton's way of saying, look, we can't understand how blacks need to define their own terms, set their own agenda, identify their own values, unless we see how we've been colonized by this greater white majority that we simply identify with America, right? So at least they have a coherent theory and historical analysis laid out in that book. There isn't an equivalent in for Black Lives Matter. And in fact, when they first put out their website, because I've been teaching them since as long as there's been of them, they had they had their principles and agenda laid out in a fairly systematic fashion. And after some severe criticism, they started pulling stuff off the website. And so I've screenshotted those things, I've made copies of them, but I have to explain to my students, look, talking about Black Lives Matter is like it's a moving target, okay? I agree, just personally, not that it's relevant to my teaching, I agree with certain of their objectives, but the means are what trouble me. In this country, I think the means have to be consistent with the ends, and I find some disjunct there. So, going back to your question, what would Douglass think about it? He thinks emphasizing any difference, even a difference that's been used to harm a people in this country, which is black people, he thinks that's a dead end in terms of ultimately becoming a part of what he believes is a good thing if it was lived out on behalf of everyone. And to get it on behalf of everyone, you can't keep emphasizing the things that differ and organize policies around that. He thinks that's a dead end. Sorry for the long answer.
So we've only had one black president.
Took a long time.
If Douglass was alive today,
Sorry, go ahead. I'm anticipating a question, sorry.
do you think it would be enough? Do you think he would still stick to his guns and say, leave us alone and the rest of that quote? Or do you think that maybe he would reconsider and say these certain people, they need, well, I'm getting to reparations is what I'm getting.
Oh, would he be in favor of reparations? He actually talked about reparations. The speech he titled On the Blessings of Liberty and Education. There's a few paragraphs in the middle of that speech where he doesn't use the word reparations, but he makes the same point that King made later in 1964, Why We Can't Wait. He said, look, you could put school and a church in every black town in this country, and you haven't come anywhere near making up for what this country has done to black people. So let's just start there. In other words, that's his way of saying anything we decide to do to help repair the damage, reparations, has to begin with the acknowledgement that the harm that has been done cannot be measured in financial terms or any other terms. Let's just start there. So, like, we cut the checks, and Claremont Jones has been very honest. She said, yeah, no, absolutely, every black person should get a check. And Congress should also pass legislation to better fund what you would call, I think, underdeveloped or underserved communities, which a lot of those tend to be communities of color. But she's quite frank. She's like, no, we're owed it. Don't ask me what we're going to do with the check. That's none of your business. We're owed it. Period. On principle. Okay. So first, no check's big enough. Okay. But if you're going to help, at minimum, you got to help do the two things most important that we need: something that will develop our mind and something that will develop our character. So the character part is church, broadly understood. The mind part is education. And so that would be his emphasis in terms of reparations. A check, we'd have to get into the nitty gritty of that for Douglass. For Douglass, he thinks, a check doesn't produce an honest person. It doesn't produce an industrious person. It doesn't produce a person who shows up on time. It doesn't produce a skilled person. Now, you're telling me federal government's gonna tell me how to use that check? Right, we're gonna have that debate. So I think we would get mired in the details pretty quickly. But fundamentally for Douglass, he's not gonna move on policy until he can persuade people on principle. What do we understand ourselves? How do we understand ourselves as Americans? And what is it that, therefore, as Americans, we are all owed by our government? Not because I'm Hispanic, not because I've got a certain last name, or because I'm male, or because I'm college educated, or whatever, but because I am a citizen of this country. What am I owed? Okay? Common country, common citizenry, should have common policies. So I think he would start there. I thought you were going to ask if he was alive today and was president or running for president. And he was actually asked that question. If you were president, and he started laughing. That's why I started laughing because I thought that's where you were going to go. He said, look, the idea of me as president is laughable. Might never will happen. But if I was in a position to announce one policy, the one policy he said this country has to take seriously is equal protection under the law. Full stop. It's the flip side of what I was saying earlier about no exceptions. Don't make an exception of black people. Don't make an exception of any people in this country. Get us to start living more consistently with what we at least wrote down, what we profess to believe, which is equality. We're all equally human, and in terms of America, in terms of our debt to each other, our duty, what we owe each other, our obligations, our equal citizenship. Right? King in his I Have a Dream speech talks about our citizenship rights. King is a learned man. He knows citizenship is a noun and not an adjective. He deliberately replaced civil rights with citizenship rights to teach America what civil means. It doesn't mean black. It means what you are owed as a citizen. Chip your hand up?
Yes. Would Frederick, I have to, so he said no exceptions, right?
Don't make black people an exception to the rule.
So for college acceptances, what do you think?
I always get the affirmative action question. So you want me to say what you don't want to say. Would Frederick Douglass be in favor of affirmative action? On principle, no. On principle, no. But don't move the bar. Michelle Obama made a big deal about that when Barack Obama was first running for president. She said they always move the goalposts on us. Oh, this is what it means to achieve, and then when black people start doing that, no, this is what we got to do. No, it's got to be this high, right? So Douglass would say, equal, treat us equal. Now that we know what the bar is, okay, now it's up to us to do what? All right, do I have to get a tutor? Do I have to study harder? What things do I have to not do so that I have time to do these other things? Okay. So he would, I think in principle, he would be against it because it would reinforce the stereotype that we have towards certain minorities. That unless they have extra help, they can't achieve. Now, that raises a practical question, right? And that question is, well, you just said tutor, didn't you? You think every family in this country can afford a tutor? My family couldn't afford a tutor when I was growing up. So I would not have that as an option for me, but that doesn't mean I can't get into a college. I applied to 3 colleges. One really tough, one kind of tough, and one that was, I'm gonna get in if I wrote my name in gibberish, okay? And I got into all 3, thankfully, but if I didn't get into the top one, well, okay, I wasn't ruled out of the game in the second one. And so there were still opportunities for me there. But those are challenging questions, the practical ones, in terms of the folks that don't have the time to send their kid to this after-school program where they're studying another hour or 2, and so they can crush the SAT or whatever it is that the colleges want you to show that you can, fill a seat and do well there. But I think in principle he would be against it because it makes an exception of certain minorities, not all minorities. Is there a hand way back somewhere? No?
I mean, I have a generic question.
Sure.
Seeing how, I guess you mentioned how his stance changed.
Towards America generally, yeah.
Towards America.
Yes.
The idea of treating everybody equally, in theory, is a good idea, but practically it's not reality. So if you say like how he, based on that theory, he would not be for like affirmative action and things like that, do you see that any possibility his opinion on that changing as he sees that the whole treat us equally isn't turning out to be wrong?
The short answer would be, we've never tried justice. We've never tried justice. What do I mean by that? Douglass complained on more than one occasion that it seemed that whites had a habit of helping blacks in the worst way. In other words, it seems like the things white people wanted to do for black people usually didn't help black people and certainly feathered white people's nests. So Douglass said, you know what? Why don't we take a break from charity and so-called beneficence drives for us? In other words, like we're the stepchildren of this country. He says, why don't you guys just try justice for a while? Why don't you just try justice? And I think that's what he meant by let us alone. But let us alone meant is, don't mess with us when we're on our way to the ballot box. In other words, don't get rid of that ballot box. Don't make it harder for us to find a ballot box, right? Don't pass laws that make it illegal for us to learn. Don't close your shops to black people when we're trying to learn a trade. His sons, able-bodied men, could not find a shop that would help apprentice them because of their color. So for Douglass, his plan his plan A, B, C, and D is, let's try justice for a while. And he had every confidence that blacks could measure up, as long as you didn't move the goalposts. Yeah, as long as you made it, they didn't use the word equal opportunity back then. We say that a lot today. The word they used back then, whites and blacks, was fair chance. Give us a fair chance. Give us a fair chance. Right? A fair field of testing. So he would say, can't we muster up a political majority that would be in favor of justice for a while? So for example, we have never had a Supreme Court that actually believes that the Constitution is colorblind. Never. Never meaning never. Like not 1 second. I don't care what political persuasion you are, Democrats, Republicans. Republicans are noted for being the party that's against affirmative action. They've had as many as 6, 7 appointees to the Supreme Court. Never have there been 5 of those appointees who have believed what John Marshall Harlan said in 1896 as the lone dissenter in the Plessy case, that our Constitution is colorblind. And Douglass said that 30 years earlier, that color should not be the criterion of our rights. You guys are itching to go, I know. Last question?
Would Frederick Douglass believe that race is something that's societally constructed, or that it's something that innately exists, but that we should ignore?
We should certainly ignore it in terms of policy. We're never, I asked you guys to look around the room, and I told you to notice differences. You do it ineluctably, right? You don't have to try to do it. I'm going to make sure I see females. I'm going to make sure I see Hispanic. No, you just see it. The question is, can we see color, but color not matter in terms of how we proceed to interact with one another? Okay. So Douglass isn't going to say to ignore race unless it has to do with public policy. He says in that case, yeah, he agrees with Justice Harlan, or Justice Harlan agrees with him. Constitution is colorblind. When it comes to my rights as a citizen, my race or sex has nothing, and religion, creed has nothing to do with it. So we can't go around pretending we don't notice the obvious. The question is, well, now that you've noticed it, so what? Right? Here's your homework lesson. Read a short story, a very short story by Ralph Ellison, published in 1944, called In a Strange Country. It's about a black protagonist named Mr. Parker. He's a member of the Merchant Marine, and he's on shore leave in Wales during World War II. He's a black man. He gets jumped by white American soldiers. foreign soil. And he's rescued by a guy named Mr. Caddy and a few other white Welshmen. And the rest of the story is Mr. Parker's experience with these whites in a strange country. Their hospitality, not just being saved from this racist American, white American mob, but then being invited to a private singing club. And if you know anything about Wales, which you don't, but if you knew anything about Wales, because I didn't either, singing, and especially male choirs, that's their thing. Like, you may think singing is your thing. Sorry, you're not Welsh. That's their thing, okay? So Mr. Parker's invited to this exclusive club and watches these cats sing, and they go, yeah, we know what you guys over in the States have done. We've learned some of your songs. And by your, he means what? What we call Negro spirituals, slave songs. In other words, these guys who are experts in music saw some expertise across the pond and made it a part of their repertoire. And it's a story that concludes with Mr. Parker being asked indirectly to lead them in singing the national anthem of the United States. Remember, it's World War II, and we took a side in that war, just to remind you. They have him lead the singing of the American national anthem after they have sung a Welsh folk song, and then have them sung God Save the King or God Save the Queen. And I won't give away the climax, but in the climax, let's just say that Mr. Parker learned something from these whites about what's possible with those whites that he has had a mostly different experience with back home. And I would say for me, that story, written 8 years before Invisible Man was published, that story, I start my race and equality class with that story every year, because it puts on the table all the relevant questions with regard, or most of the relevant questions with regards to what's good about America, what's bad about America, and what is it that we could have faith in that could lead us to have any sort of progress into the future. I know it's a bad comparison to compare today with slavery. That's kind of like a super low bar, right? But yeah, today, how would we move today to a place where we can